Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this seminar on the Emancipatory Future Studies platform. The Emancipatory Future Studies project has been around since 2019, and essentially it's an attempt to think about subaltern world-making from various perspectives. We look at it through critical theory and epistemologies. We look at emancipatory futures in relation to climate temporalities, decolonial futures, emancipatory futures in history, grand ecocentric futures, systemic pathways into the future, and of course, eco-utopia and dystopia, and of course, questioning technotopia. We've had many platforms like this, having engaged conversation around crucial sort of theoretical ideas, approaches, frameworks that can help us think emancipatory futures. We are very fortunate in this particular seminar series to have Eleonora Roldán Mendívil, a political scientist and educator. Since 2016, she has taught at several universities in Germany and Austria on intersectionality, racism, and colonial history. Currently, she is a PhD candidate at the University of Kassel in Germany. Her research interests include Marxism, anti-racism, gender relations, and historical education. Together with Bafta Sorbu, she has published the anthology, The Diversity of Exploitation, a critique of prevailing anti-racism in German in 2022, now in its fourth edition. The anthology is due to be published in English by the end of 2024 with Brill and Haymarket. She is currently a visiting scholar in our EFS program. So welcome to you, Eleonora. And we really look forward to journeying with you over the next 3 days to learn from your perspectives. And I think today is about racial capitalism. Tomorrow will be on gender and social reproduction, and then a public lecture on the new right and socialist futures. So over to you.
So there will be 3 talks from my side. I'm very happy that I can be hosted by the Emancipatory Future Studies and present some of my thoughts, and I'm very eager to discuss them, actually. So put them up for debate, and let's please have conflict and discussion. I'm always very happy to do that in order to get arguments a bit more sharper. My name is Eleonora Roldán Mendívil. I am based at the University of Kassel with my PhD project, but Vish is also my second supervisor. So this is why I'm here in Joburg. We can go to the next slide. What I want to do in the next about 25 to 30 minutes is basically present part of a chapter that I'm writing on race, racism, imperialism, and the migration question. So my PhD tries to look into the relationship of exploitation and oppression and how we can look into that from a Marxist perspective. So it tries to elaborate a methodology to better understand on a global scale the kind of totality of society, but with the focus on class, gender, and race. So this is just like a subchapter of a subchapter that I'm presenting. So I hope that the arguments will resonate with you. And if not, again, I'm very happy to discuss this. I've been involved with the concept of racial capitalism because in the German context where I'm mostly working, there's been like this resurgent take up of this concept. And I want to start like my introduction with that. We can go to the next slide. Because when we look into what Cedric Robinson in his 1983 book was doing with this concept, basically he tried to explain to us how, in his words, the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions. So too did social ideology. This is like his baseline. As a material force, then, it could be expected that racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emerging from capitalism. I've used the term racial capitalism, this is when he uses the term specifically, to refer to this development and to the subsequent structure as a historical agency. We can go to the next slide. So having this in mind, right away, I was like, okay, so what is racialism for Cedric Robinson? Someone that a lot of people right now are referring to, specifically in the kind of European left, abolitionist movements, anti-racist movements. So for him, racialism is the legitimation and corroboration of social organization as natural by reference to the racial components of its elements. So this is, again, very like he's trying to define, make his ground, right? We can go to the next slide. If we look into Robinson's work, actually, he doesn't use racial capitalism any often in this like 318 pages, right? So he makes use of the concept altogether like 5 times. But then when we go to the introduction, that is like a way newer introduction by Robin D.G. Kelly, we see that what he describes as racial capitalism becoming a common part of our shared political language is something that he refers to 19 times. So in his introduction, he is focusing on the concept of racial capitalism, which again, Cedric Robinson per se doesn't do in his own work. We can continue to the next slide. So with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been around for a long time, but which has like had a new peak around 2020, but also an internationalizing peak where you see people in European cities, people in South Africa, people in Brazil going to the streets, demanding an end to racist violence against specifically Black bodies. We see that this has been also like spreading the kind of gospel of racial capitalism. So in academic literature, but also activist pamphlets and also chants and, placards, we see more and more this racial capitalism idea or narrative, right? We can go to the next slide. I brought some pictures also from the protests in Germany just to locate my own academic existence, really, because as being part of this like kind of German academic establishment, in my research, I look a lot into racist formations, specifically in the German context, how that is connected to the German economy and to different laws that are being put in place by the European Union, but also by the German government. And we see that racial capitalism through the BLM movement within Germany has also had like this kind of revival. Interestingly, in Germany, the protests were very wide and very broad, but not much attention, in the beginning at least, was put to the numerous deaths of migrants and specifically also Black people in Germany in the hands of the police. So George Floyd was a name that everybody knew, but Uri Jallo, which is one of the most high-profile cases where this asylum seeker about 15, 20 years ago was murdered burned to death in a cell by 2 German policemen, where this case was way less known by even BLM activists. So I also brought another image where you can see in the second picture on the right, his name, Uri Jallo, so that we can understand and locate also our own racist history concerning police brutality and police violence, for example, in the global north in a German context, which I found quite important. We can go to the next slide. So I suggest that the very imprecision of the term, because the term can say everything and nothing, like it can mean the connection of race and class generally. It can mean capitalism is necessarily racist. It can mean, depending on the interpretation, that questions of gender and sexuality are already debated and included within the concept of racial capitalism, but it can also mean that they're completely excluded and we just look in class and race when we say racial capitalism. So what I say is that the very imprecision of the term, racial capitalism is hardly in any activist and or scholarly work that I've been looking at from the English-speaking world, but also from the German-speaking world. It's mostly used, but not often defined specifically what people mean with that concept for their own research and for their own geographical and historic location that they're looking at. I feel that this term doesn't provide necessarily a deeper understanding of how the modern capitalist mode of production, and this is something important for me, is linked to the racist formations and how the political economy is related to different forms of racism at specific times and specific locations. And I will elaborate. I also contend that neither does the concept help politically for organizing the revolutionary subject that Marxists define as the working class in its entirety. Being a Marxist scholar, of course, I don't mean any kind of identity position like the workers, and the workers are more revolutionary than everyone else. And if you're not a worker, you can't be revolutionary. And as Marxists, we're not interested in you. This is not what I'm saying, just like to get that straw man out of the room. What I mean is that through the analysis of the political economy of our society, as Marxists, we understand that the capital-labor relation and the contradiction that stems from them produces, if we boil it down, two central classes, and then these classes can look inside of them socially very, very different, right? Because this class is global. If we speak about the working class, those who produce the riches, all the riches of society, we mean also people who are indirectly maybe connected to wage labor. So Lise Vogel has presented a, for me, very useful definition of who is the working class, if we speak as Marxists of the working class. So it is everyone that in the present, in the past, or in the future has a direct or indirect dependency on wage labor. And this includes children of workers, it includes pensioners, it includes even the people who don't have a job, but who are part of this reserve army. So the working class, I don't mean like this idea of like just the industrial or urban working class, but I mean everyone who has this link to wage labor directly or indirectly, that we are dependent on this. And being part of that class means that we have a political and an economic position of being able to like put stop to the production process, and with this have a huge power in our hands if we recognize this power, and if we recognize that there's a transhistorical subject that we have the potentiality to become. So I'm not speaking about identity categories. I don't mean like, I feel like a worker and this is why I'm revolutionary, nobody else is. But I mean this really in Marxist terms as like a structural analysis of who has the power economically to like change all of this, to hold all of this. We can go to the next slide. So there's a text that I found very important that Marcel Parrott and Zachary Levinson wrote, where they look into kind of the history of the term racial capitalism beyond Cedric Robinson, because Robinson actually uses this way later than some South African Marxists and also some people in different African countries and in the US. We can go to the next slide. So they call it a traveling concept as well. And I think this is really useful to think about it, also to think about the usages and how we can actually, like what possibilities we have with this term. So from the mid-1970s to the late 1980s, a number of scholars and political activists discussed questions of imperialism, apartheid, anti-racism, socialist revolution openly, which included making use of the term racial capitalism, and at times it didn't. So they say, quote, radical academics were using the term simultaneously and even earlier elsewhere in Africa and the United States. We could go to the next slide. So one of the kind of histories of racial capitalism. Next to someone, Blona, he is called, that in 1972 used this term in the US to describe the situation of the Black masses in the US, who was more interested in the race and racism part and didn't actually present a economical analysis, which we do find then in the South African context in the late 60s and beginning of 70s, specifically in discussions that were edging and also confronting the South African Communist Party's perspective and policies. We can go to the next slide. This is where different theories of racial capitalism will come into play. So the SACP theorists believe that the fight against racism should be waged separately from the struggle against capitalism. This is like the 1970s. First, the national democratic stage, and then the fight for socialism. By contrast, organizers from various independent radical formations, like Trotskyist, Maoist, Black Consciousness, and many others, insisted that neither capitalism nor racism could be challenged independently in the South African context. A successful strategy required them on simultaneously and in their specific contexts. We can go to the next slide. So this is where foreign investment and the reproduction of racial capitalism in South Africa comes into play. A very important text pamphlet. It's kind of both written by Martin Legacy and David Hampson. We can go to the next slide. They engage with racial capitalism in a form that later on also Harold Wolpe, but also Neville Alexander will engage with, looking into the specificities of the economic reproduction of race relations in the South African apartheid regime. Neville Alexander will also use this term racial capitalism in order to kind of build also a different kind of movement that was critical of the South African Communist Party, but also of the African National Congress. So his organization was called ASEPO and was, he was part of like a group that tried to bring radical Marxist perspectives together with Black consciousness into a single organization. We can continue going. So we see that racial capitalism is like this concept that is kind of popping up in the US. It's popping up in different African contexts. As in the specific South African context, Alexander contended that the ANC and the SACP reinforced divisions on racial as well as on national lines. In fact, the Congress tradition within South Africa maintained divisions between African, Indian, colored, and white activists. So basically reproducing the same categories, the same racist categories that the apartheid regime was putting on people, right? We can go to the next slide. So Alexander stressed how this perspective obscured an analysis of class division within racial groups, and foresaw the likelihood of co-option of the movement against South African apartheid by the Black middle class, leading it away from the potential of socialist revolution. And ta-da, this is basically what we have today. For Alexander, the national liberation struggle needed a working class leadership. This was very important for him. Something other nationalist and Marxist organizations, such as the Communist Party, rejected actually, because they had this idea of a kind of cross-class alliance in order to fight the apartheid regime. We can go to the next slide. So knowing that in the 70s, we have all of these discussions on racial capitalism, and specifically the South Africans are at the forefront to understand the specific economic linkages of race and class for the South African context, and also the Southern African context, because there was a lot of analysis also on like what back in the day was called Rhodesia, etc. So this is not just South Africa, but Southern Africa specifically, and the liberation struggles connected to it. In 1983, we have this book that has had a really interesting trajectory since then, Black Marxism. We can go to the next slide. For those who are not too familiar maybe with the whole work and have maybe used racial capitalism as a concept, but don't have maybe referred even to Robinson, but without maybe like a deeper understanding, I want to give like a very, very quick summary of what is happening there in order to criticize or maybe to show the limitations. I wanted to say it like in a nicer way, let's say. So Robinson starts with European antiquity. He tries to understand in his own research, and he goes to archives. Like it's a really like it's a beautiful narrative as well. Like he writes really well. How already in European antiquity through that stage into the Middle Ages, there was like racial component to the organization of society. So he says in the European Middle Ages, it is a Muslim conquest of the Mediterranean and of what later is to become the Caliphate of Al-Andalus in the 7th and 8th centuries AD that interests him in his genesis, because he wants to look into how race was made in that process. Robinson sheds light on 16th century Irish colonization by the British Crown, and on the 18th and 19th century, when the English ruling class pitted Irish immigrant and British domestic workers in Britain's mainland against each other, something that also, for example, Karl Marx was looking at in his own time in the 19th century. From here, he goes on to look into the experience of exploitation and oppression of Africans brought to the Americas as enslaved cargo. So this is like his central contention, and his central focus is Africans and their descendants in the Americas. We can go to the next slide. In order to kind of bring this analysis together, he tries to also trace something that he calls a Black radical tradition. For him, this Black radical tradition is embodied by people like W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, or Richard Wright. So we see that these radical intellectuals, socialists, that in their own time within the Americas, on the one hand, the US, but also C.L.R. James being himself from the Caribbean, going to the US and later ending up in the UK, also somewhat of like a traveling political figure himself. He looks into this tradition and he tries to kind of put people who had quite different politics, actually, if we look into their biographies and if we read on which also political currents they were part of. And he tries to put these different, especially African-American thinkers within the socialist movement into a kind of tradition of radical thought that is connected to anti-colonial struggles starting from the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, plantation rebellions, kind of this organic production of resistance knowledge, right? And he tries to show that there's a whole tradition of people being close to a socialist movement, being part of the Marxist left of their time, but then also that they themselves found limitations within that left and within Marxism and started to wander to other, let's say, grounds. This contention, we'll just leave it at that for the moment. We can go to the next slide. So Robinson says, the critique of the capitalist world system acquired determinant force, not from movements of industrial workers in the metropoles, but from those of the backwoods people of the world. So he's referring to revolutions like the Chinese one, or also even the Cuban Revolution. Western Marxism has proven insufficiently radical to expose and root out the racialist order. This was his critique. This was his all-encompassing critique towards Marxism, right? And towards specifically what he called Western Marxism, though he didn't quite define what Western Marxism meant for him, which is, again, I think a problematic point, because even within Western Marxism, there's a lot of different traditions, and there are a lot of different histories also in the context of imperialism, anti-imperialism, race, and racism, something that I'm working on in my dissertation to prove that there were progressives within the Marxist movement, that not everything was like Stalinized, let's say. And we can go to the next slide. So then, to put this together, for Alexander, right, racial capitalism allows for the apprehension of the unique, indeed, the exceptional character of South Africa. This is what he analyzes in the 70s. It shows that the political economy of white supremacy in South Africa differed from that of the rest of the continent, and for that matter, of the United States. It's not the same. For Robinson, on the other hand, the racial capitalism is a global phenomenon. So he is kind of globalizing this. It is not limited to a particular nation state, and it emerges at the beginning of European expansion. So it's quite different understandings of racial capitalism here, right? We can go to the next slide. Legatic and Hampson's use of the term we're going back to this pamphlet, stresses a clearly socialist project, as they used the concept of racial capitalism to critique South African liberals who argued that apartheid was a dysfunctional aberration of capitalism that could be abolished through the improvement of better organization of South African capitalism. A position shared by many white South African capitalists, by Henry Kissinger and the US State Department, and by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So this was their central critique. We can continue to the next slide. But then, on the other hand, this would, like Legacy, Kempson, but also Wolpe and Alexander are contesting. Robinson brings onto this like kind of global perspective. From his view. He says, from the 12th century on, one European ruling order after another, one cohort of clerical and secular propagandists following another, reiterated and embellished this racial calculus. I would contend that this racial calculus that he is talking about was not necessarily even a racial calculus. When we look into Robinson's work, he kind of says these things, but he doesn't prove it. Right? You would have to do archival work. You would have to prove historically that there was a racial calculus that we can call racial, because much of the calculus that was there was a definitely class-based feudal calculus, for sure, which sometimes overlapped with the idea of like the insiders and the outsiders. But the racial idea, the idea of like this, like inherently different peoples of somewhere else that need to be kind of civilized, didn't necessarily like kind of permeate all of that society, all of those societies, specifically European societies. This is what I would contend. We can go to the next slide. So Robinson does not define racial or race, which is, again, a problem, because I think that we have to be very clear about what we're speaking here. Something that, for example, Alexander, etc., do. For him, racial capitalism entails an awareness and knowledge about the capitalist system that engenders the universal category of race within its origins and further spread. So race was necessarily like a category that was like part of the accumulation process of every kind of capital-labor relation where it began. I have questions. Though many of Robinson's historic accounts are valuable and inspirational, and this is, I think, very important, his assertion that through each historical epoch of European history since antiquity, race was an ordering principle epistemologically on the level of an organizational and an economic structure, moral authority, justice, commerce, and power seems to me far-fetched and bears no historical evidence to back up this very universal claim. And I've really tried to find people who are backing this up, and I couldn't so far find, at least in German and English, something that could back this up, for example, for the Middle Ages or for the like 16th century, 17th, 18th century. It kind of starts in that time. We can go to the next slide. I'll need another 5 minutes of your time, and then you can hit me with everything you want. Though Satnam Virdi, and this is a very important text that I, on a historical materialism issue, has convincingly argued that certain early forms of specific bloodline markers, this is not race, bloodline markers, and the idea of inherited cultural traits and predestinations can be traced back to the early epoch of nascent absolutism, such as in the Spanish kingdom, starting with the Reconquista at the end of the 15th century. So we're speaking about specifically the Jewish and Muslim populations. Racism in its modern form is a phenomenon that needs to be placed in the interface of early modern times around 16th and 17th century. This is what I would say. I don't think this is something like from antiquity we can see like till today. I think there's specific changes that happen so that race was even possible as a universal concept of order. And I think this has to do very centrally with capitalism as this hegemonic form of production, universalizing itself through colonialism. And only in this moment that a certain form of alienation towards me as the worker, the people who is working the land or working the mine, etc., is happening, that only in that moment could like this universal category of race be formed and formulated, which was obviously also enshrined into different civil codes, into marriage codes, into the whole kind of colonial order, right? We can go to the next slide. So Black Marxism enriches our understanding of a variety of societal structures and class struggles in the pre- and post-colonial world that have been sidelined by the historiographic canon of Western academia, as well as by different Marxist traditions. So I would still recommend to read Black Marxism, right? I think it's a very important work. Appreciating this important enrichment, my main concern with Robinson's Black Marxism and the implications it entails for the concept itself is twofold. These are my two central critiques. First, the suggestion that Marxism and its methodological approach of dialectic historical materialism is Eurocentric and thus has little to offer for the liberation of non-white people around the world. And second, his essentialist suggestion that there exists a transhistorical Black radical tradition, which advances the problematic idea of an undifferentiated category of oppressed humanity defined by ahistoric essentialized identities. What is this Black radical tradition supposed to be? Who is part of that and who is not? Who decides what is the radical and what is not radical? And what if these people that are put all together, like people like Ciola James and Richard Wright, which, you know, one was a Trotskyist, one was part of the CP, in their own time, they couldn't, like, you know, see eye to eye because they were heavily fighting each other. How come, like, suddenly through their Blackness, they are put into like one category of like this Black radical tradition? So I think that there are some essentializing elements that are very problematic here. We can go to the next slide. And we're also getting ready to finish this kind of input. Some shared interest of a group of people made organic by an essential ascribed identity, generally racial or ethnic, often premised as well on some singular cultural tradition, has come in recent decades to eclipse the language
Have we lost Eleonora there? Gosh. Hi.
Hi,
Jane,
Michelle.
we've lost Eleonora. Okay, we'll just wait for her to come back. I'll get in touch with her. Sorry about this. So just bear with us. Eleonora just called me. She's trying to get back in. Apologies for this. Hmm.
Okay, so I hope, yeah. I'm back
Continue.
again. I'm wrapping up. I'm
Go
sorry
ahead.
for that. Sometimes the internet likes to kick us out, or sometimes just Zoom doesn't like us. Okay, so to get to my conclusions. This idea of like this one group with like ascribed identity is something that has been like more and more counterposed to like a class position, which is not like necessarily like a class identity, because that is something like quite different. So I feel that when reading through Robinson, and also specifically in like the new abolitionist German context, we have a lot of people referring to racial capitalism, but then nothing of what they do has any form of class analysis. They kind of drop it, and then it's fine. We all know it's racial capitalism. Again, I have a lot of questions for the German context, what they actually mean, but they're not neither describing nor defending their concept. They're just like using it, and mostly to not speak about class and kind of have like a race-first politics. So this is also something that has to do with the way that in activist circles, but also political and scholarly circles, this has been dealt with, and why I felt that I had to write like some form of critique to this. We can go to the next slide. So with a number of Anglophone critics, I contend that Robinson and his followers have a false understanding of the historic anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggles and achievements of socialists and communists all over the globe, which are very contradictory, but which exist. But it gets like kind of seen in a very monolithic way of like, you know, Marxists, they were like Eurocentric, and this is why we can't use any of that in the forms for like in a form of understanding race. This again gives space to a condemnation on his part of workers' organizations with a socialist or communist outlook per se, where he thinks that there's no potentiality for revolutionary struggle there. Robertson does this without distinction of specific currents or any form of interpretation of the contradictions within these organizations and parties. We can go to the next slide. So what are the possibilities of this concept? I think that, as we can see with the South Africans, there is a historic specificity where we can use the concept of racial capitalism. I would use it in the quoting and referring to the people like Legacy, Kempson, Alexander, etc., to look into, in specific moments of history, how does class and race interlink in a way that the class power is based on a racist formation within the capitalist mode of production. And I think that makes sense in very specific historic and geographical locations to use this concept. I do think that when we do that, it makes sense to link it to Marx's labor theory of value, to the theory of social reproduction, and also of superexploitation as elaborated by Marini. This is something I will talk about tomorrow. We can go to the next slide. Coming to an end. So basically, my own conclusions from this kind of trying to engage with the different traveling concepts of racial capitalism from my own research, which is on the one hand, a theoretical research. I'm trying to produce a methodological answer to the question of the relationship of exploitation and oppression, and how we can build global and lasting movement to overcome capitalism. What was inspiring and helpful to me was to understand in which moment we go from speaking about capitalism suddenly to speaking about patriarchal capitalism, racial capitalism, different adjectives and capitalism, and to understand that a specific hegemony of some Marxist thought, which was reductionist, which was economist, and I won't just say was, which is reductionist and economist or productivist, that this has led through the 70s, 80s, and 90s to this kind of post-structuralist, more postmodern understanding of like, oh, all identities are just equal and everyone can just, you know, has the potential to struggle. And I would say, yes, everyone has the potential to struggle, but identities are formed within the capitalist mode of production. They are centrally not an essential thing. Like, I am not a woman, I am not, you know, but I become in relation to a system that is capitalist and that is essentially breaking people up into these fragmented identities. So my conclusion, to kind of have a more uplifting, maybe also discussion of this is that there is a potential in understanding the errors of the left in the past, and also being sympathetic to critical inquiry of Marxist thought, like Robinson's, to find new ways of organizing in a way that we can actually reach the working class, the exploited in all their facets of being within this very violent and ecocidal system that we call capitalism. We can go to the next slide. And with this, I want to wrap it up. I've talked long enough. I'm really, really curious for your questions and critiques. I might not be able to answer everything, but I will note everything down. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Eleonora. That was fantastic. So yeah, it's open for engagements, comments, clarifications, questions, and so on. Provocative, interesting. Anybody? Any takers? So Eleonora, I'll just break the ice. I mean, it's just got to do with Cedric Robinson. I mean, do you think that he was furnishing a kind of Black nationalist reading of the sort of genealogy of racism, but also trying to stake out and capture what he framed as a Black radical tradition, homogenizing it in so many ways and so on? So maybe you could say a little bit about his politics and positionality, so we understand a bit more, if you have a sense of that. I'm struck by how people like Angela Davis and others still kind of vaunt his contribution and his legacy, etc. So there's something there about a kind of Black nationalism that I want you to speak to. So, you know, from what he tried to do in his work, but also its kind of real political resonances and his own politics. Yeah, I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to say something to that. Just quickly, a friend who's also in like part of the webinar said that they can't like write in the chat. So maybe it has to be open so that people can actually participate. Just as a quick side note on kind of organizational matters. So yes, I agree. This is definitely a reading of, it's in its time. I mean, we're talking about 1983. It is a Black nationalist reading, I would call it, which is also something that is like floating in the air, right? We're in a time when this is like a post Black Panther Party and also equivalents in the UK, where also Robinson was working a lot, moment and an understanding of, you know, if the kind of white left can't find good answers to the violence, historic and in that moment that we're experiencing, that we need to have like a different approach that is centered on who we are and our own history of colonization and, you know, enslavement, etc. So I do understand this in this tradition, and I think, again, and I hope I made that clear, it's not like I'm just like, you know, dismiss Robinson, don't read him. Quite to the contrary, I think we have to engage with what he's trying to do, because not just the kind of historical archival work that he did in this work that no Marxist, for example, before him had done, as far, at least to my knowledge, in this condensed matter, is something that I think is very, very useful. But these pitfalls, as you were also saying, you know, with Angela Davis, etc., of kind of not differentiating enough what the own critique is, because I think in his own, what I understand from his own political engagement, he was trying to kind of bring all these kind of the Black radical intelligentsia together from like across the pond, right? He tried to have this like kind of Pan-Africanist, but more like global North centered, because if you think about also his book, it is mostly about the Black enslaved experience in the Americas, right? It is not a book about African forms of trying to answer this contradiction, because there is a lot to say on that. He didn't work on that. He worked on something quite different. Like half of his book is on Europe, starting with that, which is very, very intriguing. But I feel that one has to be a bit cautious about looking into, when we go into more like the end of the book, where like he puts his conclusions down, but basically he rejects any form of like organizing within, for example, labor unions, different socialist, communist political organizations or parties. And he brings about, you know, C.L.R. James's experience and Richard Wright and all of these people that kind of left their non-Black organizations in a very specific moment, and all of them out of very different reasons as well, which I would say are centrally political reasons. Some of their critiques being very important, and some just being like in the moment, in just a very retrograde moment. You know, these people like James in the 30s and 40s and 50s, just had a very different political landscape. So with what we know today, I would say that I can, and I always say that kind of thing, like I can understand where Robinson comes from. There's like a sympathy to that position, but I think it also has a very, it can have very essentializing and complicated repercussions. And I think this is something that when I look into the European Academy, certainly this is happening. People are using Robinson for altogether not even anti-capitalist projects. They're just like saying racial capitalism, and then they do whatever liberal thing they want to do. And I see that as very problematic. Yeah.
Trevor, you have your hand up. Please go ahead. Welcome. Where's Trevor? Trevor, go ahead. I'm very incompetent with Zoom. So Jane, do I have to enable? What do I do?
Because you're the host, you just hover over Trevor and then select allow to speak.
Oh, sorry. Trevor, you now have voice. Go ahead, Trevor.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Sure, Comrade Vish, long time.
Long time.
Yeah, man. Yeah, nice. Yeah. So thank you, Eleonora. Yeah, I'm very interested in this concept of racial capitalism. So I'm glad you kicked off your series with it. But, you know, I'm groping for answers. But starting with Cedric Robinson, yeah, I do think that his argument is that racism is essential, or, you know, capitalism is always like that. Whereas other theories, other Marxist theories have argued for the concept of contingence, that, you know, it's contingent, it depends on a situation, which is not to say the majority of cases will have racism as essential or as important to capitalist exploitation. But, you know, matters can change maybe from case to case. But certainly that has been the overwhelming experience in many countries, especially colonized countries, certainly in the USA. And then my second point is on the German comrades, analysts or theoreticians not take into account migrants. Yeah, I agree that is not good. You know, it's a choice they are making, you know, so maybe they can be persuaded. Otherwise, I don't think it's you know, it goes necessarily with the concept of racial capitalism. Of course, I can hear Comrade Eleonora saying the real problem is that people use it in their various ways. So in itself is not tight enough. I can agree, but it made me to want to pose a question. You know, what is a traveling concept? At first, I thought I understood this, but now I'm starting to think, you know, yeah, imperialism, you can debate it, but imperialism of the USA, the imperialism of China, I don't know whether it qualifies to be a traveling concept. And then my last point, I hope I'm not taking too long, Vish. My last point is, yeah, I have no problem if it clarifies things to call capitalism ecocidal, patriarchal, racial capitalism. I mean, people talk about crony capitalism. Certainly, they don't talk enough about neoliberal capitalism, tending to focus on neoliberalism as if, you know, it's separate from capitalism. So, like we talk about bourgeois democracy. So, you know, I think the concept can be recuperated or saved or be deployed. I don't know if that's what you are saying in Eleonora, that we should use it in certain ways, define it more clearly. I would agree with that, but it's not to be discarded, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor. Over to you, Eleonora, and then we'll take Josh after this. Go ahead.
Okay, so thanks, Trevor, first for being here. Very happy to meet you. Yeah, I guess that you would say something similar to this because I've been reading up on your work, and of course you have a affiliation to this concept, and that really makes sense also, I think, in a study of the South African reality. So what I'm basically saying it's not that, for example, within the European context, people are not using it in order to understand the migration question, let's call it, right? They are, but they're using it in a form to kind of reduce the migration question and the question also of racism to a level of kind of very I will say superficial non-class analysis of what is happening. So that would be like my contention or my critique. A traveling concept, what I meant with that when I used it is that, you know, when we try to find, okay, who said this first and who is like the precedent and who is the first person who kind of made use of this in which way, for racial capitalism, there are actually multiple avenues that kind of cross, because this concept through the discussions of different Marxist and non-Marxist circles discussing questions of imperialism, apartheid, anti-racism, etc. in the 60s and 70s, this concept started to emerge in different places. So what I am saying is that normally scholars who use racial capitalism as a concept will refer to Cedric Robinson. But I think that it can be helpful to actually refer to, for example, the South African tradition of theorizing racial capitalism in a quite different way that I find more compelling than how Robinson is doing it. So this is what I mean with like traveling concept. And of course, this concept is also now traveling to different places with very different historic formations of racism. Like in Europe, for example, when people speak about racism, mostly they mean anti-Black racism, like when kind of the liberal establishment speaks about racism. Though the Black population in Europe is very, very small, and we have like a lot of racisms that are even inter-European, non-color coded racisms that have to do with the political economy of these places and with the specific history of these places. For example, anti-Polish or like, you know, people from the Balkan states racism, anti-Greek racism. So there's like a lot of different forms that we have to understand through the different migration flows that exist. So anti-Black racism is prevalent, is violent in Europe and also in places like Germany, where I'm from. But it's not the only form to think about kind of racism in Europe. And I think this is like it's also something that I try to like elaborate on and like kind of expand in order to understand the specificities of racism in certain geographical locations, right? And then there was something on, I think, like, should we use this concept now? Like, what am I saying? I would basically say that we can use this concept, but it really depends for what we use it and how we use it. So for me, when I speak about capitalism, I mean the totality of capitalism. And the totality of capitalism, for me, engenders questions of gender relations, sexuality, human nature relationships. But I have to make that clear when I speak about capitalism, because I really don't want to put more and more adjectives in front of the capitalism that I'm speaking about. I want to make sure that as Marxists, when we speak about capitalism, we are speaking about the totality. And for that, I am someone who is looking into some particulars of this totality, being specifically gender and race and their relation to class. So I hope that gives a view, and we'll continue the talk over some coffee.
Josh, I've given you permission to engage. Go ahead.
Thank you. And thanks, Eleonora. This was a really interesting presentation, and it's lovely to see you present on your work. I had a question that went back to something that you mentioned in terms of you're not sure that anybody has backed up Robinson's thesis that racism is a part of at least European society since sort of ancient times. There are a couple of classicists and historians who have made varyingly strong arguments about how far back racism goes. Geraldine Heng in particular to the sort of Middle Ages, and Denise McCoskey to antiquity, so to sort of ancient Greece and Rome. And I guess the question isn't so much, like, you're wrong, actually race exists since, for 2000 years kind of thing. But I guess my question is, what's at stake if racial thinking has been around longer than the emergence of capitalism as a sort of historical socioeconomic formation? So if Heng is correct and we can date kind of very similar forms of racism to contemporary racism back to the medieval period, the Middle Ages, what then is at stake if we can date it back, as McCoskey sometimes maybe seems to be saying, but much less strongly, to kind of when Cedric Robinson puts it, around ancient period? What does that mean for our contemporary understandings of racial capitalism if those things do not emerge roughly simultaneously in the way that, like, Eric Williams talks about slavery and colonialism and as the production of contemporary understandings of race? Thanks.
Over to you.
So, yeah, I was thinking right away, of course, of like some researchers who are doing exactly the contrary, but I can't think of their names right now. So there is like some studies on like, medieval African merchants in Europe and how their experience was not at all like connected to any form of like anti-Black racism or anything. And even if we look into how different African and descendants of African populations were even described in the like 12th, 13th, 14th century by different monks and stuff of the time who had access to writing, there I would contest is not at all the same kind of idea of like this like kind of the Black body as something completely alien and something that is like inferior in any way or and such. But of course, there is also research that tries to do exactly the contrary. And I think that first of all, what that would mean, let's say, for us as race or racism scholars, or also people who try to understand just like, again, the totality of like modern capitalism, is that if we find racist formations as an organizing principle for societies before the capitalist period, then of course this also means something different onto how we think about the emergence of capitalism in certain forms. I believe that the, for me, more compelling narrative is that to understand that, capital was around for a long time, but the moment that we can speak about actual global capitalism is a quite newish moment, like somehow like in the emergence of like end of 16th, 17th century, like more prominently in the 17th century. And this has to do with like European world colonization and colonialism, right? The moment that this factor of the relation of the people who produce to the product and being, being not able to decide over this product that I've produced with my own labor force, that this moment of alienation creates, I would say, at least a significant other relationship to how we can think about human populations, and how also the alienation process gives way to a form of scientific racism, because I would also differentiate between racism as a kind of form of that organizes modes of production on racial lines, and racial thinking. I think racial thinking is something that has been there for a long time, but it didn't necessarily become like an organizing factor on a central, in this centrality as we can see it through the expansion of the European colonial empires. And actually, I would contend that this is like it doesn't have to do necessarily, this is a quite like US-centered narrative of like, oh, it has to do with like the enslavement of Black people, and then you have to legitimize this, etc. But before like a mass of African peoples were enslaved by Europeans, there's the massive enslavement of First Nations peoples in the Americas, and the first kind of race hierarchies being produced through that, and specifically to identify indigenous, native, and then different like mixed populations, and then populations of white, of European descent that became white, as we know, right? Like different European people were not just like white from the beginning, but this kind of racial hierarchies start to evolve through the necessities of the colonial economy that was inherently an economy that was like the midwife of global capitalism. But these were already all relations of the enslaved native peoples of the Americas, and then later on also of the enslaved and later Africans, and then also indentured, you know, Chinese and Indians, etc., that were all part of this like capitalist system. So what change would that make for our contemporary understanding of race and racism? I think that we would have to think of how we think about something like prejudice. Is prejudice something that like is just there and just evolves, or is it like kind of formed through like certain also necessities of different forms of production and reproduction? So maybe that question is kind of a nitty-gritty question that is not even that important for our nowadays like understanding of this. But for me, to understand that racial thinking was around, but that racism as this like ordering principle comes about, and can only come about in this like kind of global, with this global phenomenon of European colonization and the spread of a like kind of capitalist gospel, is something that makes more sense to me in order to understand how the possibility of race thinking becomes an ordering principle later on through the possibilities that kind of capitalism gives to it, and also because it can be functional to capitalism. But of course, racism is also something that can go way beyond a functionality principle. It becomes very irrational. I mean, with Marta Szabo, we have edited a book on racism formations in Germany from a Marxist perspective, and we kind of always say, you know, the different genocides committed by like the German state, be it in Namibia or somewhere else, were actually not functional to capitalism, if you think about it, because they were like killing workforce, right? This is not a functionalist argument. So there's something more that then happens in 19th and 20th centuries, specifically when we look into the question of genocide. But yeah, this maybe goes beyond, but these are just some thoughts, and let's keep up the conversation on that, because it's not final thoughts on what kind of concrete change would that make. Yeah, it's just some ideas.
Wonderful. Kennedy, I'm giving you permission to talk. Go ahead, please, Kennedy. Kennedy?
Hello, you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation on racial capitalism. I just want like to make some comments and a little bit of, I think, some questions. On the comment, like the first one, I want to believe if we are to marry the racial capitalism philosophy or thought from Robinson and the racial contract by by Charles Mills, it would make more sense because like when he speaks about like the racial contract, he's saying like all the philosophers, maybe Immanuel Kant, Hobbes, etc., who talks about the social contract. It was all about to mediate and regulate how how a certain race, a white race is supposed like to organize themselves politically, right? To say there's supposed to be a social contract between the citizens and the governors. But when it comes now to non-white population, there is nothing of that sort. In fact, like the same social contract or the same racial contract, it gives the white populations a leeway to oppress, to colonize, to do whatever they can do to those non-white subaltern communities. Same maybe like when they were doing their own colonialism. There was nothing of any sort to talk about when it comes to social contract. But their philosophers, they had already done a lot of work around that particular concept. So I want to believe like it would make more sense like to say if we are to marry the two books themselves, it is going to be very much clear. And also I want to just make a comment to say racial capitalism, the way you articulated it, we were discussing this. It's a colloquium to say that kind of a philosophy, it makes some human subjects or the bodies of other human subjects not only getting killed, but they are made killable. To say why other people can commit genocide, or like why the white racial contract would permit or would legitimize the commission of genocide in some other, say, maybe subordinate communities in the global south, for example, now or even like during colonialism. The reason being, the way it was founded, it legitimizes their contract to even kill or to commit suicide, like to commit like genocide. But like not only that, but it made other people's bodies killable in a way that you are represented as the other. That we and them a kind of an attitude, it's like it's everywhere. So by so doing, when you are told you don't belong, the meaning of which is you can be killed, you are killable, you can be expropriated, right? In fact, like you are non-human according to their own definition of it. And I also wanted to give a comment to say, you talked about the racial capitalism as a traveling concept. I think I understood that well. But then now to say in the context of South Africa, where the Congresses, say during the time they were fighting against apartheid and like even colonialism, you could find an Indian Congress, colored Congress, Black Congress, and all those ones. In a way, they are also defined and also articulated in racial grounds. So even today, those variegated groups, even if like they are no longer called by that a categorization to say Indian contracts, like Indian Congress or something else, isn't it also a matter of the coloniality of racial capitalism, even if its logic is to try to destroy like the same, to say we are still categorized or divided into these racial lines. So isn't it like kind of a coloniality of the concept itself, to say it's a traveling concept? We are seeing it manifesting in today's political and economic affairs, but in a way that we are also trying to dismantle it, but it is a self-reproducing itself in the same way. Then the question I want to ask regarding resistance, what is the methodology given by Robinson when it comes to say how are we supposed to resist ratio capitalism, whether
Thanks.
universal or maybe within the Black like communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Over to you, Eleonora. There's quite a lot.
So I
there.
heard part of it because I was kicked out again, but I think the first part was more of a statement and bringing like the whole question of decoloniality and coloniality of different of this concept like together. And then the second question was on the question of resistance, right? So I got that. I'll speak on the resistance question, and if I miss something, Vish, you can help me or someone else. So this is one of my biggest critiques when we look into Robinson's work. Again, I think that his project in the 80s, in a also time when actually his work was not widely read, his work has had a resurgence like in the last about 10 years, but specifically with Black Lives Matter and with this new forward by Kelly in 2020, the sales have gone up and the discussion has gone up, and everybody speaks about Robinson and kind of all the social sciences, at least on all conferences internationally, also nationally in Germany, where I have been. There's been even a whole racial capitalism conference at my university, where actually the first time I presented this critique that people were very confused by because everybody just loved him. And I just like to be the person like bringing in the hard questions, I guess. So if we look into his own ideas on any kind of strategic political question, you won't find much. And as someone who sees themselves as, or who wants to see themselves as like a Marxist, of course, like I'm always like, where's the program? Where's the program? Where do we go from here, right? So he kind of grouped a Black radical intelligentsia around him in the 80s and 90s, and people who've taken up his work. One of them, of course, being Kelly, but also many others. And he had this idea of a kind of Black organizing, but very, very unspecific, as far as I know. Please correct me if anyone else has different knowledge on this. And I think that I'm always very critical of concepts that don't have, I mean, they don't have to have like, you know, a 10-point program at the end of their publication, but at least we should find something that we can bring into like our practical everyday reality of organizing, of trying to not just resist abstractly, but to create also a different future. So, you know, emancipatory futures is something about, for me, it's not something utopian that, oh, you know, we have to think about something out of the box, because we are children of capitalism, right? We are limited in the way that we can think about alternative futures by this very monstrous system that is crushing us and everything around us every day on different levels, less and more visible, depending on where you stand from your consciousness, but also from just like the perspective where you live, etc. So I feel that his idea of having more people specifically of African ancestry and heritage to engage with histories of resistance and histories, you know, of struggle, and this kind of empowered view of an African tradition and a tradition of people of African descent. This is something I'm very sympathetic to understand, you know, the racist view of, you know, yeah, the slaves, they never kind of, they never resisted, they never did anything. That this is not true. And we have many people starting already in the 30s with C.L.R. James himself, with his very different take and the research on the Haitian Revolution, right? That has given like a rise to a different perspective. But when we take away the class perspective on this, when we take away a kind of specific aiming towards a future that is not just a liberation for people like African peoples and people of African descent, but for everyone, right? Then I think we're limiting ourselves and even the way where we can take our radical traditions from. I don't think that because I was born in South America, my tradition is some tradition of intellectual and spiritual and, you know, struggle, thought and practice just from that place. So the universality for me, that kind of the universal humanism that I encounter in Marxism is not something that kind of limits me to Europe, but that connects me actually universally in my humanity to everyone. because all of us will have very different biographies, will have very different positions just where we are. We didn't choose to be a migrant, not be a migrant, be a woman in society or not. This is something that society puts on us in a relational form, but we can choose what kind of future we want and in what kind of future we want to live. And I don't think we can envision it yet in like all aspects, but I do think that something that Robinson positively gives us is an understanding that it is not enough to think about the capitalist mode of production in just class terms. And I agree. I think this is something very important. I'm being criticized a lot, for example, in German Academy for being a class reductionist, an economist, and all of that, even though my main research area is racism, right? So I'm like, I do think thinking and criticizing race, not just thought, but race orders and this relation is crucial to an socialist project, right? So there is something that we can learn from here, but I think we have to take this way further, and we have to also take this a bit, read Robinson more critical, specifically when he kind of pushes all socialist, communist projects to the side, saying like they're all Eurocentric, they didn't have anything to offer like to the Black man and all of that. I don't think so, and it is way more complicated. There's a very complicated and contradictory legacy, I would say, of anti-racism in the international left. And this contradictory legacy, I would want to take the most progressive parts of that legacy and try to kind of bring them forward and bring these voices, you know, like an anti-colonial Rosa Luxemburg and like all of these people, like from Mariátegui that I spoke about on Saturday, to other radical socialists, and also like this left critique within socialism of the economist positions, to bring them to the fore and to kind of project this into a program that we can all rally around. And I think this is the beauty of a socialist project. Everyone can join. I wonder if a project of a Black radical tradition and Black radical struggle, that everyone can join that. I don't think so. And this is why I think there is a limitation that we have to overcome.
Excellent. So listen, we have 5 more minutes. I just feel with just that powerful kind of input from Eleonora, we kind of reached a culmination moment, unless there's something burning anybody wants to ask. This is a ongoing conversation. We're meeting again tomorrow at 3, and Eleonora is going to build on this or add to this around gender, social reproduction, and so on. Is there anything anyone wants to ask before we wrap up? I mean, this has been a fascinating talk. I mean, tracing the sort of itinerary of this concept of racial capitalism, you know, sort of locating it in different parts of the world, which I think is very interesting. It has a particular inflection and kind of approach in the South African context. You know, it also is facing a challenge. We have 30 years of a Black government in South Africa. We have 30 years of attempting to deracialize capitalism in South Africa. And so, you know, how we put it to work here, these are some of the complexities that we're going to have to grapple with. I also think there was a wonderful sort of engagement with Cedric Robinson, and a critical one. Yes, there's a lot to learn. And, you know, the way he's kind of historicized racism and brought into view sort of different forms of racism, etc., I think is useful. But then again, there are some downsides there, and I think Eleonora rose to that challenge and helped us. But I think to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, please join us tomorrow. There's going to be more of this exciting, robust engagement, thoughtful engagement, critical engagement. So we'll see you all tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Take care. Bye-bye. Eleonora, before you go, I couldn't make it on Saturday, but can you share the link to the recording of your talk on Mariátegui, and we can put it out on the EFS platform? How's that?
I will. I'll ask Peter and all of them for the recording. I think they're going to put it on YouTube next days, and I'll send it to you for sure.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to stop
Yes,
recording.
yeah, you're going to stop.
Okay, I don't
Thanks,
know how
Ash.
to